Ethan Brooks kicked the side of his rust-colored rover, cursing as the engine sputtered to a stop. He pulled his cap lower over his brow and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Piece of junk," he muttered before grabbing his tools from the back. The atmosphere of K-17 was thin and dry, the kind of air that made your throat feel like sandpaper after a few breaths. Not that he minded much, he'd been to worse places in the galaxy. The rover was parked near an abandoned mining outpost, one of hundreds scattered across the system. The mining companies had stripped the planet of anything valuable decades ago, leaving behind empty husks of equipment and crumbling structures. Ethan was here on a supply run, scavenging for parts to fix up a freighter he'd been working on for weeks. He was expecting a dull day of prying loose bolts and sifting through metal scrap. What he wasn't expecting was the faint sound of movement behind a pile of rusted beams. He froze, hand immediately going to the small blaster on his hip. "Hello." He called out cautiously, scanning the debris for any signs of life. The sound came again, this time a soft, rasping growl, more pitiful than threatening. He tightened his grip on the blaster and stepped closer. What he found made him stop in his tracks. The creature crouched low, its scaly body trembling as it pressed itself against the edge of a collapsed beam. It was about the size of a medium dog, but that's where the comparison to anything Earth-like ended. Its skin was a dull greenish-gray, stretched tightly over visible ribs. A long, whip-like tail twitched nervously behind it, and its large, triangular ears perked up at his approach. Its face was angular, with a short snout and sharp, intelligent amber eyes that followed his every move. "Well, you're not exactly cute," Ethan muttered, but his tone softened as he crouched down to meet its gaze. The creature let out a weak, low growl, bearing a set of jagged teeth. It was a warning, but the lack of strength behind it told Ethan it was starving, not dangerous. He slowly lowered his blaster and reached into his pocket, pulling out a protein bar from his ration pack. "Easy, buddy. I'm not gonna hurt you," he said quietly. He tore off a small piece and tossed it a few feet in front of the creature. It eyed him warily before sniffing the air, its nostrils flaring. After a long pause, it crept forward on shaky legs and snatched the food, retreating to its corner to devour it. "Guess you've had it rough out here," Ethan said, watching as the creature licked the ground where the crumbs had fallen. He tossed another piece, closer this time. The creature hesitated but eventually inched forward to grab it. Ethan noticed the way its sharp eyes never left him, calculating and cautious. Unbeknownst to him, a cloaked ship hovered above the mining outpost, its occupants watching the interaction with rapt attention. The alien surveillance team had been monitoring the planet for weeks, conducting a study on human habits and behavior. To them, the creature Ethan had stumbled upon was classified as a Type 7 nuisance species, a pest that thrived in abandoned colonies and scavenged whatever it could to survive. They had written it off as insignificant. "What is the human doing?" one of the aliens asked, its voice a mix of static and clicks. Its elongated limbs twitched as it gestured toward the display screen. "The creature is of no value. It is inefficient to waste resources on it." Another alien tilted its head, its black, featureless eyes fixed on the screen. "The human appears concerned for it. This behavior requires further analysis." Back on the ground, Ethan had managed to close some of the distance between himself and the creature. He held out the last piece of protein bar in his hand, palm open. "Come on, you've already got more guts than half the folks I've worked with," he said with a soft chuckle. The creature hesitated, its tail twitching erratically. After what felt like an eternity, it crept forward, its nose brushing against his hand as it snatched the food. For a moment, its rough tongue grazed his skin. "There we go," Ethan said, grinning. "See, I'm not so bad." He noticed the way its ribs jutted out sharply and the way its legs trembled with every step. "You're not gonna last much longer out here," he said, more to himself than to the creature. He stood slowly, careful not to startle it, and gestured toward his rover. "What do you say, pal?" "You want a ride?" The creature tilted its head, ears swiveling as it looked from him to the rover and back. Ethan walked to the vehicle, leaving the door open before pulling out a small water canister. He placed it on the ground and backed away. The creature hesitated before limping toward it, lapping up the water with desperate gulps. "That's it," Ethan said softly. When it finished drinking, it stood there watching him. It didn't run when he approached and opened the back of the rover. With a little coaxing, it hopped in, curling up awkwardly among the scattered tools and spare parts. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, glancing back at his new passenger. "Guess I gotta call you something," he said, tapping the wheel as he thought. "How about Scrap?" "Seems fitting, considering where I found you." The creature blinked at him, unblinking and unreadable. Ethan took that as approval. "All right then, Scrap, let's get outta here." Above them, the aliens continued to watch, their confusion deepening. Why would the human expend effort on such a creature? One asked. Another replied thoughtfully, "Perhaps there is something about humans we do not yet understand." Ethan leaned back against the hull of his freighter, sipping a steaming cup of synth coffee as he watched Scrap investigate the hangar. The creature had been with him for 3 days now, and to Ethan's surprise, it seemed to be recovering faster than he'd expected. Its once jagged movements had smoothed out, and its gaunt frame was slowly filling in. It still had a cautious air about it, but there was a curiosity in its amber eyes as it sniffed at bolts, inspected crates, and pawed at his toolbox. "Hey, don't mess with that," Ethan called out, pointing at the pile of carefully sorted parts he'd scavenged earlier. Scrap froze mid-step, one paw hovering over a crucial stabilizer coil. It looked at him, huffed, and much to Ethan's amusement took a deliberate step back. "Smart little guy, aren't you?" Ethan muttered, shaking his head with a grin. He took another sip of coffee, watching as Scrap moved on to the next item of interest. It nudged a wrench, then picked it up in its jaws and carried it over to Ethan, dropping it at his feet. Ethan blinked. "Well, I'll be damned. You trying to help me out now?" Scrap tilted its head, tail swishing behind it. Ethan bent down to pick up the wrench, holding it up like a prize. "Thanks, pal." "Didn't know I hired myself an assistant." Scrap gave a short, sharp bark, a noise Ethan hadn't heard from it before, and sat down, watching him expectantly. The bond was forming faster than Ethan had anticipated. Scrap had started following him around the ship, shadowing him as he worked on repairs or ran diagnostics. At first, Ethan thought it was just hunger or instinct driving the creature to stick close, but it felt like more than that now. It watched him with an intensity that suggested understanding, like it was trying to learn his habits, his routines. Meanwhile, the cloaked alien ship remained in orbit, its crew continuing their observation. One of the officers, a tall being with iridescent green skin and elongated limbs, slid a translucent panel onto the console. "The creature exhibits rapid improvement," it remarked. "Its behavior is notably altered under the human's care." Another officer, smaller and hunched over, studied the display. "Humans are known for their resourcefulness, but this level of engagement with a lower species is unusual. The bond they are forming may be worth further analysis." The taller officer tapped its slender fingers against the edge of the console. "The creature itself displays unique traits. We may have underestimated its potential." Back on the freighter, Ethan was learning just how unique Scrap really was. He first noticed it when Scrap started growling low in its throat during one of their walks through the hangar's perimeter. Ethan had been scanning a crate of spare fuses, but Scrap's sudden shift in demeanor made him pause. He followed its gaze to a shadowy corner, where a small, venomous vermin, one of the planet's nastier inhabitants, had slipped into the hangar. Before Ethan could react, Scrap's body stiffened, and its skin emitted a faint, eerie bioluminescent glow. The light wasn't bright just enough to cast a dim aura around the creature, but it was enough to startle the vermin. It let out a sharp screech before scurrying back through the crack it had come from. Ethan stared, dumbfounded. "Okay, now that's new," he said, crouching down to inspect Scrap more closely. The glow faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Scrap looking almost sheepish. "You've got some tricks up your sleeve, huh? What else are you hiding from me?" Scrap blinked at him, unbothered by the question. Later that evening, as Ethan tinkered with the freighter's navigation system, he found himself talking aloud. "You know," he said, glancing over at Scrap, who was curled up on an old blanket nearby, "I can't figure you out. You're not just some stray, are you? You've got, I don't know, something more going on." Scrap lifted its head, ears swiveling toward him. "Were you abandoned, left behind, or did you just wander too far from home?" Scrap didn't answer, of course, but it held his gaze for a long moment before resting its head back on its paws. Ethan sighed. "Yeah, I don't blame you for keeping quiet. The galaxy's a rough place. I've seen plenty of folks get left behind when they're no longer useful." He tightened a bolt on the console, his expression hardening. "But not you. We'll get you back to full strength and then—" "Well, we'll figure it out." Unbeknownst to Ethan, the aliens had been listening. Their surveillance equipment recorded every word, and the officers debated the implications of his musings. "Could the human be correct?" the smaller officer asked. "Could the creature have been abandoned by its own kind?" "It is possible," the taller officer replied. "But the human's attachment to the creature is more perplexing. He shows no indication of seeking personal gain from this relationship. His motivations are unclear." The debate was interrupted by a sharp alert on their console. The taller officer studied the readout before turning to the others. "I propose a test." The plan was simple but calculated. As Ethan piloted his freighter through an asteroid belt the next day, the aliens subtly interfered with the ship's systems. A minor calibration error here. A flicker in the power supply there enough to create a sense of urgency without causing immediate danger. They wanted to see how the human and the creature would respond. Ethan didn't notice the sabotage at first. He was too focused on navigating the dense field of spinning rocks, his hands steady on the controls. But Scrap noticed. The creature's ears perked up and it let out a series of sharp barks, its tail lashing against the floor. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, glancing back at it. Scrap darted to the console, pawing at a flashing indicator light that Ethan had missed. His eyes widened. "Damn it, power fluctuation in the stabilizers. Good catch, buddy." He sprang into action, handing the controls over to the freighter's autopilot as he scrambled to the engine room. The stabilizer relay was overheating, and the backup systems were sluggish. Scrap followed close behind, barking again and again until Ethan noticed another issue, a small but dangerous crack forming in the coolant pipe. Okay, I see it." Ethan shouted over the whine of failing machinery. He grabbed a sealant patch and slapped it onto the pipe, stabilizing the flow just in time. Scrap's growls and barks continued, directing his attention to other trouble spots as they emerged. Together, they worked in frantic harmony, patching, calibrating, and rerouting until the ship finally steadied. When the last warning light dimmed, Ethan slumped against the wall, breathing hard. Scrap sat beside him, panting but alert. "You," Ethan said, pointing a finger at the creature, "are a damn lifesaver." Scrap licked his face, and for the first time, Ethan didn't flinch at the rough texture of its tongue. He laughed, ruffling its head. "Guess you're not just some stray after all." "You're my partner now, Scrap. What do you think about that?" Scrap let out a happy bark, its tail wagging furiously. On the cloaked ship, the observing aliens were silent. Finally, the taller officer spoke. "The bond is undeniable. The human sees the creature as more than an inferior life form. He sees it as an equal." The smaller officer tapped its claws against the console, deep in thought. "Perhaps this human's adaptability is what makes their species so unique. We should continue to observe." Ethan's freighter broke through the swirling debris field surrounding the trade station, its patched-together hull groaning in protest as he adjusted the controls. The station loomed ahead, a sprawling, chaotic web of interconnected modules that looked more like a drunk spider's fever dream than a functioning hub of commerce. Lights flickered erratically across its surface, and the chatter of varied frequencies filled the cockpit. Scrap sat at his feet, watching the viewscreen intently, tail twitching with what Ethan could only describe as anticipation. "First time at a trade station, huh?" Ethan said, glancing down. "Don't worry, it's not as bad as it looks. Just gotta keep your head down, avoid anyone who looks like they bite," and he paused, smirking at Scrap. "Actually, that might not apply to you," Scrap huffed, a short, sharp sound Ethan had come to think of as its way of rolling its eyes. The docking process was, as usual, a hassle. Ethan exchanged curt words with the grumpy station operator over the comm, who finally granted him clearance to dock at a less than ideal berth on the outer ring. The freighter landed with a metallic thud, and Ethan powered down the engines, exhaling deeply. "All right, pal," he said, standing up and stretching. "Let's see what kind of trouble we can get into." The station's interior was a sensory overload of alien species, languages, and smells. The air was thick with the aroma of charred meats, metallic tangs of machinery, and the unmistakable scent of desperation that hung around places like this. Scrap stuck close to Ethan's leg, its ears swiveling constantly as it took in the chaos around them. Ethan could feel the curious stares directed their way. Scrap wasn't exactly inconspicuous, but most people seemed too busy with their own problems to bother them. Ethan's first stop was a merchant he'd dealt with before, a grizzled old Lormac with scales the color of tarnished copper and a perpetual scowl etched into its reptilian features. The Lormac stall was a cluttered mess of spare parts, tools, and miscellaneous contraptions that Ethan suspected even the merchant didn't know the purpose of. "Ethan Brooks," the Lormac greeted him in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Still flying that bucket of bolts, I see." "Good to see you too, Carex," Ethan replied, leaning on the counter. "Got a list of things I need, and as always, I'm hoping you'll give me a decent deal." Carex snorted, a puff of hot air escaping its nostrils. "You're lucky I tolerate your presence, human." "Let me see the list." As Ethan handed over his datapad, Scrap nudged his leg, drawing his attention. The creature's eyes were fixed on one of the items on the counter, a small, crystalline component that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What that thing?" he whispered. Scrap barked softly, its tail wagging. Carex noticed the exchange and narrowed its eyes. "Your pet seems interested in something." Ethan waved a hand dismissively. "It's just curious." "Ignore it." But as Carex turned to examine the datapad, Ethan picked up the crystal and turned it over in his hand. Scrap gave a single, affirmative-sounding bark, and Ethan realized the creature wasn't just curious, It was trying to tell him something. "All right, add this to the list," Ethan said, setting the crystal down. Carrick's glanced at it and grunted in annoyance but didn't argue. The negotiation process was as tedious as ever, with Carrick's trying to wring every last credit out of Ethan while the human countered with exaggerated tales of his ship's dire state. Scrap sat quietly for most of it, but every now and then it would make a soft noise or nudge Ethan's leg, subtly guiding his choices. By the end of it, Ethan walked away with not only everything on his list, but also a few extras that Scrap had evidently deemed important. As they left the stall, Ethan crouched down to eye level with Scrap. "All right, what's your deal?" he asked, holding up one of the items Scrap had insisted on, a sleek, oval-shaped device with no obvious function. "How do you even know this stuff is worth anything?" "You've got some kind of sixth sense or what?" Scrap tilted its head, giving him a look that was almost smug. Ethan shook his head, chuckling. "Fine, keep your secrets. But if this thing turns out to be junk, I'm blaming you." Their errand took them to other parts of the station, and it wasn't long before Ethan started noticing the way people stared at Scrap. Most of the looks were curious, but a few were distinctly hostile. He overheard snippets of conversation, words like pest and vermin muttered under breaths as they passed. One merchant outright refused to serve Ethan after spotting Scrap, hissing something about damned scavenger beasts before shooing them away. It wasn't until they stopped at a small food stall run by a wizened old alien that Ethan got some answers. The merchant, a soft-spoken Rilu with feathery antennae, hesitated as it handed Ethan his order. Its large, multifaceted eyes flicked nervously to Scrap. "You should be careful with that creature," it said, voice low. Ethan frowned. "Why, Scrap's harmless." The Rilu shook its head. "Creatures like that were bred by the Calthorans long ago, an extinct race now, but their creations remain. They were used as guards, hunters, enforcers, dangerous and highly intelligent. Most people see them as threats, even if they're not aggressive." Ethan glanced down at Scrap, who was sniffing at the food in his hand with no particular concern for the conversation. "Well, Scrap's not like that," he said firmly. "It's just trying to survive, same as the rest of us." The Rilu gave him a pitying look. "Intentions don't matter here, perceptions do. Keep it close, human. Not everyone will hesitate to harm it." Ethan's jaw tightened as he handed over his credits and walked away. He looked down at Scrap, who was blissfully unaware of the warning. "Don't worry, pal," he muttered. "I won't let anything happen to you." Back on the freighter, Ethan unpacked their supplies while Scrap wandered the ship, inspecting each new addition with its usual curiosity. As Ethan worked, he noticed something odd, a faint, rhythmic beeping coming from Scrap's direction. He followed the sound to where the creature was curled up on its blanket, its eyes half closed in a state of contentment. "Hold still," Ethan said, kneeling beside it. Scrap looked at him quizzically, but didn't resist as he ran a scanner over its body. The beeping grew louder when he reached its neck, and Ethan's stomach sank as the scanner highlighted a small, embedded device beneath the skin. "Of course," he muttered. "Should have known." Scrap watched him with quiet trust as he retrieved a surgical tool from his kit. "This might sting a little," Ethan warned. The creature didn't flinch as he carefully extracted the tiny device, a bead-like tracker no bigger than a grain of rice. Ethan held it up to the light, his expression darkening. "Someone's been keeping tabs on you," he said. Scrap growled softly, as if it understood. Ethan crushed the tracker under his boot and tossed the remains into the nearest waste chute. "Not anymore." "You're with me now." The words felt heavier than he'd expected, but Ethan meant them. He ruffled Scrap's head, earning a happy bark in response. Far above, In the cloaked alien ship, the tracking signal disappeared from their monitors. The crew reacted with a mix of frustration and intrigue. "They've discovered the tracker," one officer said, its voice sharp. "We've lost our primary method of observation." Verk, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Perhaps it's time for a more direct approach." The others hesitated. Interfering with a human is risky. "Their unpredictability is well documented." "All the more reason to proceed carefully," Verk replied. Its gaze lingered on the darkened screen. "But I believe this human can offer insights we've never seen before. If we are to understand humanity's resilience, this bond may be the key." Ethan was elbow-deep in the freighter's control panel when the lights flickered and dimmed. He yanked his hand back just in time to avoid an unexpected spark and cursed under his breath. Scrap, lounging nearby and gnawing on a spare piece of tubing, perked up immediately. The creature's ears twitched, and its amber eyes locked onto something Ethan couldn't see. "What now?" Ethan muttered, glancing toward the cockpit. He sighed and dusted his hands off, stepping down from the maintenance ladder. "If it's another coolant line, I swear I'm gonna—" He froze mid-sentence as a low, resonant hum filled the air, reverberating through the ship's metallic frame. Scrap growled deep in its throat, the bioluminescent glow that Ethan had once found fascinating now flickering across its scales like an instinctive warning. Before Ethan could reach for his blaster, they appeared. It wasn't a flashy entrance, no dramatic lights or thunderous noise. One moment the corridor was empty, and the next, 4 towering figures stood before him, their forms too alien to mistake for anything else. They were slender and angular, their movements unnervingly smooth, like water flowing upright. Their skin shimmered, constantly shifting between iridescent hues, and their black, pupil-less eyes reflected no light. They wore no armor, no visible weapons, but their presence was suffocating in its intensity. "Human," the lead figure said, its voice layered and echoing as though a dozen voices spoke in unison. "We have come for the creature." Ethan's heart raced, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "You're gonna have to be more specific," he said, stepping protectively in front of Scrap. "This creature has a name, by the way. It's Scrap, and Scrap's not going anywhere." The alien tilted its head, an eerily precise motion. "You misunderstand. The organism in your care is classified as a dangerous invasive species. It poses significant ecological and biological risks if allowed to remain uncontrolled." Ethan snorted. "Uncontrolled. Scrap's done nothing but help me since I found it. If you're looking for risks, maybe start with whoever dumped it on that mining outpost to rot." The alien's eyes narrowed, though its expression remained unreadable. "Your attachment clouds your judgment. This being's capabilities are beyond your comprehension. It is not meant to coexist with lesser life forms." Ethan bristled at the insult, but Scrap was already moving. The creature darted out from behind him, its movements fluid and purposeful. It positioned itself between Ethan and the aliens, its body low to the ground, growling with a ferocity that surprised even Ethan. The faint glow returned to its skin, illuminating the dim corridor with a soft, pulsing light. "Whoa, easy, buddy," Ethan said, reaching for Scrap's shoulder. The creature didn't flinch, its focus locked on the intruders. The lead alien stepped closer, ignoring Scrap's display. "This is your final warning. Relinquish the organism." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Scrap's not a threat to anyone unless you make it one. Judging by the fact that you're sneaking onto my ship and trying to take it by force, I'd say you're the ones being invasive." The alien's shimmering skin darkened, a subtle but ominous shift. "You leave us no choice." The air around them felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Suddenly, one of the aliens lunged forward, its movement so fast it was almost a blur. Scrap reacted instantly, leaping to the side with a speed that defied gravity. The corridor erupted into chaos as the creature's bioluminescent glow intensified, flooding the space with disorienting flashes of light. The aliens hesitated, their precise movements faltering under the sensory onslaught. "That's my cue," Ethan muttered. He sprinted toward the nearest control panel, fingers flying across the interface as he initiated the ship's emergency lockdown. Bulkheads slammed shut, sealing off the corridor and trapping the intruders in a confined space. Scrap darted around the aliens, its agility unmatched as it used the tight quarters to its advantage. It jumped from wall to wall, evading every attempt to grab it while disorienting its pursuers further with rapid bursts of light. Ethan grinned despite himself. "You're a damn ninja, Scrap." But the aliens weren't giving up easily. One of them extended a hand and a translucent, web-like filament shot out, snaring Scrap's hind leg. The creature yelped in pain, its glow dimming as it struggled against the trap. Ethan's stomach dropped. "No, you don't," he shouted, grabbing a nearby tool, a heavy metal wrench, and hurling it with all his strength. The improvised weapon struck the alien's arm, disrupting its hold on the filament. Scrap tore free, limping slightly but still determined. Ethan reached for the emergency override on the panel, his mind racing. He needed to disable the alien's tech, but their gear didn't exactly scream user-friendly. Then his eyes fell on a power conduit running along the wall. It was risky, but it was his best shot. "Scrap, cover me," he yelled, grabbing an insulated glove from his belt. The creature barked sharply and resumed its chaotic assault, drawing the alien's attention away from Ethan. He yanked open the conduit panel, exposing a mess of wires and circuits. His hands moved with practiced precision as he rerouted the power flow, sending a surge of energy through the ship's systems. The lights flickered violently before going out entirely, plunging the corridor into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then Scrap's glow returned, faint but steady, casting enough light for Ethan to see the aliens stagger, their shimmering forms dull and erratic. Their tech was failing. "That's right," Ethan said, stepping forward. "You messed with the wrong junker." The lead alien turned to him, its voice strained but still layered. "This is not over." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not, but it's over for now. Get off my ship." The alien hesitated, its form flickering like a faulty hologram. Then, with a soundless burst of light, the intruders vanished, leaving behind only the faint hum of the ship's systems coming back online. Ethan sagged against the wall, his heart pounding. Scrap limped over to him, its glow dimming as it nuzzled his hand. "You okay, buddy?" Ethan asked, inspecting the creature's injured leg. "You were incredible back there." "Don't think I've ever had a partner who could pull off moves like that," Scrap barked softly, its tail wagging despite the pain. Ethan smiled, ruffling the creature's head. "Looks like it's you and me against the universe, buddy." The words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of the bond they'd formed. Ethan stood, cradling Scrap in his arms as he made his way to the medbay. The galaxy was a dangerous place, but with Scrap by his side, he felt like they could handle whatever came next. As the freighter's engines roared to life, the stars stretched out before them, infinite and full of possibility. Ethan set a course for the unknown, his resolve stronger than ever. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, proving that even in the vast emptiness of space, loyalty and trust could shine brighter than any star.